One of the things that I think is so amazing about Apex is the name itself. It's such a rich metaphor and it's such an aspirational term. When we live in Apex, we feel like we're living on the top of the world. But could you imagine if the town was called today what it used to be called? It used to be called Log Pond. I can't think of anything more opposite of Apex than Log Pond. In fact, for most of recorded history, the region was known as Log Pond. Instead of Peak Fest, I guess we would have to have Mud Fest. Instead of the Peak City Grill, it would be the Boggy Bottom Grill. Instead of being the peak of good living, we'd be the snake and frog and mosquito capital of the world. I think you get the picture. So I'd like to do a series on the name Apex and where that comes from. And this is the first one. I'll start with Log Pond. I want to talk about where the pond was located, how you can have a pond in a location like that on a hill, and why the term log was part of the name. And then maybe in the next podcast, I'll talk about the history of Log Pond itself, what we know about the history. All this is prior to 1873 when Apex was established. So where was the pond located? In our book, we try to put together the scientific evidence for the exact site. We rely heavily on Staley Smith of Smith & Smith surveyors who actually drew a map of the pond for us. But for this podcast, I'd like to focus more on anecdotal evidence. That's a little more interesting to listen to. One reason I know where the pond is located is because I talked to a man who was alive when the pond was still there, and he remembered it. His name was Oscar Luther. He was born in 1873, and at the time of the centennial, when I was a high school senior in 1973, he was still alive, 100 years old. The pond was there through his childhood, and he told us exactly where it was. He said, if you go to the downtown fire station on Salem Street, the pond was where the station is, and it extended to the south to where, at that time, Seymour Hardware Store was, or Seymour's store was, and nowadays it's called Peak City Grill. He had lots of funny stories about the pond. He said that it wasn't just a pond. Around it, it was very swampy, and so there were just thousands of frogs. He said at night it was hard to carry on a conversation in downtown Apex because the frogs were so loud. He and a lot of older people I grew up with taught us that the neighborhood just to the west of that area, in other words, the people who lived along Saunders Street going down that hill to the west, that community was called Frogtown. But you didn't have to know people that old to know those stories. Even when I was growing up, remnants of the pond were still there. Behind Seymour's store, which would be between Peak City Grill and the railroad track, that area was almost always wet. It was kind of swampy. If you went across Salem Street to 201 North Salem, which used to be a parking lot. Today, I think it's a cigar store. That parking lot was not usable about half the time because it was just sort of a swamp. If you went into any of the buildings, especially there next to where Peak City Grill is today, heading back to the south, after a heavy rain, you would hear water running under the building. If you talk to the owner of Peak City Grill today, he'll tell you that in order to restore that building and turn it into a restaurant back about 15 or 20 years ago, to deal with his mold and subterranean water problem, he had to haul in 180 tons of gravel. That's because his building is built where a pond used to be. Another funny story, that's not funny, but a funny story about that was when they built the fire station. That was in the 1950s. That lot had been used as a service station since the 20s. And the man who had the service station, I guess he was trying to save money or else recycle. He took a couple of old train cars that had been used to haul gasoline, and he buried them in the ground and filled them with gasoline. And that's how those were his gas tanks. Well, when he went out of business and they started building the fire station, they decided to just build over those tanks and leave them in the ground. The problem was when they took the gasoline out, the tanks kept floating up to the top and pushing up out of the ground. And so what the eventual solution was, they filled them with sand. If you want to even go there today and explore, I can give you a couple little walking tours that will show you how the pond was situated. If you start at the fire station and carefully cross the railroad tracks heading east, you'll come to the corner of Elm Street and Culvert Street. Note the name Culvert. That's there for a reason. That was a culvert to drain the pond. They drained underneath where the railroad tracks are today. Well, you'll see that there's a ditch or creek that starts right there. And it heads along Elm, sort of heading toward the south, and it cuts back toward the east. I remember when I was in high school, my high school, which is now Apex Middle School, back behind there, behind the football field, you could still see the ditch and the creek. Now, if you wanted to be really adventurous, you could follow that creek another 20 miles or so, and you'd wind up in the Neuse River. If you want to head west from the fire station, go across Salem Street carefully, walk down Saunders Street, you'll eventually wind up in the Cape Fear River because all the water that falls on that side of the ridge or the railroad track goes to the Cape Fear. But before you get there, you'll just get to the bottom of Saunders, you'll turn a hard left, and that creek will take you across what used to be the Pearson property, and then you'll cross Chatham, and you'll wind up at Seaboard Pond. If you continue past Seaboard Pond and Highway 55, that creek continues, and it eventually goes into the Cape Fear. By the way, right near 55, you'll come past the remnants of an old whiskey still, the Jinx still, Apex's first still, and we wrote about that in the book. So you can do a little walking tour and get a lay of the land and see how it works. You're probably wondering, if Apex is an apex, if it's the highest point around, if it's a peak, how can you have a pond at the top of a hill? That is a very interesting question that has puzzled me for much of my life. And I think I finally figured it out with the help of a lot of experts. There are two answers. One is, first of all, Apex is not really a peak per se, but it's a saddle along a ridge. The ridge is where the railroad tracks are today. They've been there since 1869. They tend to build railroad tracks on ridges. And so that's the high part, is the ridge. And the highest parts of the ridge in the area, I think, are where Chatham Street crosses the railroad track and where Thompson Street crosses the railroad track. But that 100 or 200 yards in between is what I would call the saddle. It's slightly lower, and so it tended to collect the water. The other thing is not what's on top of the ground, but what's below the ground. And Tim Donnelly, the town engineer, explained that to me. It's called a perched aquifer, water that's held up on a high spot. And the reason the water is held up there is because underneath the topsoil is some non-porous clay, which creates what's called an argillic horizon, sort of a bowl of clay. And that holds the water until it rains so much that the bowl is full, and then it starts spilling out on the sides, and that forms what you might call springs or Some people call them artesian wells. And so that's what you have when you go down the hill on the east side toward Elm and Culvert Street, or on the west side down Saunders. And there's springs all around to this day. People in the area can show you the springs. Another thing you're probably wondering about is, why is it called Log Pond? Well, I used to think that that had to do with the sawmill that was a few hundred yards to the east of there, the McEllington sawmill, which was sort of kind of near where Christian Home Church is today. But the more I thought about it, that didn't really make a lot of sense for a number of reasons we talk about in the book. But the obvious answer is that there were so many beavers in the area. The pond would have been a perfect beaver habitat. It was a pond on a high place, and then you'd chop down a couple of trees, build a dam, and then as you go down the hills on each side, you can build more dams to collect more water and make more ponds. And it's only logical that there were a lot of beaver in the area because, I mean, the creek that starts near there is called Beaver Creek. I remember when I was researching our book on Apex history about 10 years ago, Tim Donnelly and I went down to Seaboard Pond and walked around that and saw all kinds of evidence of beavers there, trees they had cut down. My friend Wade J. Baker was a fireman in the 1980s. He had a really funny story about beavers in downtown Apex. He said they had a fire late one night. After they cleaned up, they were just sitting out in front of the firehouse, decompressing. And they looked, and everything was quiet except for one thing. This strange creature was walking right down the middle of downtown Apex, down Main Street. And just before it got to the fire station, it turned left into the culvert there at Saunders and disappeared. And for those of us who thought that Apex, the beavers had long left Apex, that was proof that they come out at night and they're still there. Well, in the next podcast, I will talk about the history of Log Pond, what we know about the people, the animals, and the life around that pond prior to the time that Apex was formed right after the Civil War. So I definitely think Apex is amazing. I'm a little skeptical about whether Log Pond is amazing, but the more I think about it, there are some kind of amazing things even about Log Pond. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you enjoy learning about Apex history, check out the book that my brother and I wrote. It's called Pluck, Perseverance, and Paint. That's an Old Town motto. And the subtitle is Apex, North Carolina, Beginnings to 1941. Thank you. I'm Warren Holleman, and I'll check in with you later, and we'll finish the story of Log Pond.